So as I said earlier, I want to talk about the story that we read, Genesis chapter 3, and talking about original sin. Are we being punished for Adam and Eve's mistake? The literal fall has been one of the cornerstones of traditional Christian doctrine for centuries. One of the things I notice when we read Swedenborg's work is he makes a distinction between Genesis, the book of Genesis, the first 11 chapters, and then what follows from 12 to 50. And I had always thought it was somewhat of an arbitrary division. I really couldn't sort of quite grasp it exactly what he was saying. Because if you look at what Swedenborg says in those first 11 chapters, he talks about them being not historically true, that they are more of the nature of mythological stories. But as a younger man and growing up in the church, I looked at some of those stories, and some of them are quite believable, even if you don't take, say, the creation story as literal. Still, there are stories in there that seem plausible, at least. So for example, the story of Cain and Abel, that seems plausible to me. It seems plausible and reasonable that some form of a flood took place. Even if it didn't happen over the whole world, there are certainly floods that do take place over sometimes a large area. Even stories like the Tower of Babel seems to some extent plausible. But then I noticed that a number of different sites and in Christian discussion, there is still this lingering division between the first 11 chapters and what follows. And this is one example. The Bible Project, which is a YouTube site which produces stories and commentaries about the stories in the Bible in animated form, and it really is very useful. Videra put me onto it. I'd never seen it before, but it's very popular, and you can see it's a very entertaining way of helping people learn about the Bible. And they too make this division between chapters 1 to 11 and chapters 12 to 50. And what intrigues me about the Bible Project is they kind of skate around the literalism of the first 11 chapters. They don't say it's literal, but they don't say it's not literal either. They're looking at it in a different way. So there seems to be some basis for what Swedenborg says about the first 11 chapters of the Bible being not literal history, and what follows from 12 to 50 being more, or the beginning of literal history. Now, of course, many Christians will throw up their hands when I say that. What I want you to understand about Swedenborg's work when he talks about the book of Genesis, in particular we see it, is that it's not so much the idea that the first 11 chapters are symbolic that is particularly interesting. It's the fact that when he goes into history, so chapters 12 to 50, and then of course the rest of the Bible, he says that also is symbolic. You see, we tend to say, well, it's either symbolic and not literal, or it's literal and not symbolic. But Swedenborg doesn't make that distinction. He says it's all symbolic. It all has correspondences throughout it. And in fact, his definition of the word is that it has this correspondential, deeper meaning throughout it. So, whether it's historic, whether it literally took place or not, for Swedenborg is actually irrelevant. We don't need to know that. The important thing is the deeper meaning for him, and that for him is the definition, as I say, of what the word is. If we're busy debating about whether something really took place or not, we're missing the point of the word. That's Swedenborg's attitude to it. Now, what I want to do is share with you from this book today, Eve, the Bone of Contention. I have my own little copy here. Some of you may be familiar with this work, I'm not sure. Written by Reverend Dr. Michael Stanley, who is an English minister. He visited Australia close on 30 years ago, was the last time he was here, and he was actually very active in my own training in ministry. But this little book that he produced is just excellent for its size, its readability, and he's talking all about this story that we're going to deal with today. Now, Michael Stanley, as he talks about this, he puts the fall actually much earlier in the Genesis narrative than what we've read this morning. And that's quite an interesting point of view. And he points to this occurrence, the creation of Eve, as being the point where the fall begins. Because, of course, if you remember the story, Eve is the one who listens to the serpent and takes the fruit and gives it to Adam. So here are these words from Genesis chapter 2. And the Lord God said, "It is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him." Out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air, and brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. And whatever Adam called each living creature, that was its name. So Adam gave names to all cattle, to the birds of the air, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not a helper found comparable to him. So the important point to grab out of this is that out of all of the creatures that the Lord created, nothing was found that was suitable as a companion for Adam. There was nothing found that the Lord had created that the man could relate to or identify with. It took the creation of something out of himself to bring about something that he could relate to. And this is where Swedenborg identifies what we call the proprium, or the ego it's often referred to as. Now we go on in the story. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and he slept. This is the beginning of the process of the creation of Eve. And one of the things that Michael Stanley points out is that this sleep is a failing or a falling of consciousness, a loss of awareness, and it's one from which Adam never wakes. So he's said to fall asleep in the narrative story, but he's never said to awaken, even though he speaks. And so he's lost a level of consciousness. He's dropped down in his understanding of the world. And this is what is said here. So, and then it goes on. And the Lord God took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh in its place. Then the rib which the Lord God had taken from man he made into a woman. And he brought her to the man, and Adam said, "Now this is now bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." So man finds that he relates best of all to something which is derived from himself. And this is self-identity or ego. Here is the little illustration that we have in Michael Stanley's book. So Adam is lost in Eve, which represents the idea that the true self is lost in ego, or as Swedenborg terms it, proprium. So there is the beginning of the problem. And then, of course, you have into the story that we read in verse 6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took its fruit and ate. And the problem's really contained in this. A tree desirable to make one wise. That encapsulates our problem. You see, because wisdom is not ours to possess. Wisdom is the Lord's alone to give, and there's a very important difference. Now we see it in the first book of Kings, King Solomon. If you remember, when King Solomon comes to the throne, what does he pray for? He prays for wisdom. And we have a number of stories, some from the Word and some from other places, about Solomon and about his wisdom. So in that chapter 3 of the first book of Kings, we have that story of the two women who come to him with the baby. Remember, the live baby and the dead baby. Now, they present their stories, and here's the thing. Solomon is unable to make the distinction that is presented to him. He's unable to judge which baby belongs to which woman, given what each of them has said. What Solomon does is he sets in place the circumstances by which the truth is seen. You see? So he's not making a judgment of himself, he's observing something taking place. And this is wisdom. It's to recognize that we ourselves do not know the truth, that the truth needs to be revealed to us. It's not something that we can derive from ourselves, it must be derived from the Lord. Now we go on further into the story in Genesis chapter 6. So Eve takes of the fruit, she eats. Note that she also then gives to her husband Adam and he eats, and then their eyes are opened. It's not that she has her eyes opened and then he has his eyes opened, because that's the order they've eaten the fruit. It takes them both together to eat the fruit, which means that their eyes are opened. And the thing is, what is it that they see? They see one thing. They see that they are naked. And you see, their nakedness has never been a problem, was it? It was never a problem. They just didn't recognize that they were naked. Now they see that they are naked, and what they do is they create for themselves the mark of that knowledge, which is sewing together the fig leaves and then hiding in the trees when the Lord comes. You see, prior to that, they had just talked to the Lord and there was no issue. There was no problem with the nakedness. But now they see they are naked. In other words, they've come to recognize their reliance upon the Lord. And that is what makes them shameful. You see, it's that a recognition that I of myself cannot possess wisdom, but I really want to, and I'm ashamed that I can't call wisdom my own. Now, for us in the new church is indicative of what Swedenborg calls order, or in this passage, the way this has been translated now, the divine design. And what we have in this story is the divine design as it originally is, and comparing that to the state in which we find ourselves in our life today. So here is the divine design. This is from New Jerusalem in its Heavenly Doctrine. To the extent that we live according to the design, and here it is, that is, to the extent that we are devoted to doing what is good in response to the divine truths that are the laws of the design, to that extent we are human. Swedenborg goes on to say, the more we live in this way, in the orderly way, the more perfectly proportioned and beautiful we will look in the other life. The less we live in this way, the more monstrous we will look. Okay? So there is the design. That's the way we're supposed to live our lives. That is descriptive of prior to the fall, the Garden of Eden state for us. That's what we've lost. However, we are born not with goodness and truth, but with evil and falsity. So we are not born into the divine design, but into something contrary to that design. And he goes on to say, that is why we are born in utter ignorance, and why, in order to be brought into the divine design and thus become human, we must of necessity be born again, that is, regenerated, which is accomplished by means of divine truths from the Lord and by a life in accord with them. So, and that is descriptive of the state after the fall. So we have this pristine first state, the divine design by which we're supposed to live, but this is the state we find ourselves in. And the means by which that's restored, that first state is restored, is what Swedenborg calls regeneration, and sometimes is called rebirth. So he says, when the Lord is regenerating us, he arranges everything in us according to the divine design, that is, according to the form of heaven. The more we live according to the divine design, the more intelligence and wisdom we have. See, there's that intelligence and wisdom again. We must come to rely upon the Lord to be considered wise. We cannot rely upon our own intellect and our own strength. So look, Swedenborg has this fundamental difference between literalist Christians and himself, in terms of the literalist Christians will say, well, you know, the story of Adam and Eve, the creation story, happened as it is written in the Bible. It's literally true. But of course, Swedenborg disagrees with that. It's more in the sense of a myth, or if you like, a just so story that seeks to explain the condition we find ourselves in, which is that we are born out of order and we must be restored to it. That's the point of the story for Swedenborg. But one of the things that can happen sometimes is people, especially literalist Christians, will say, well, if you don't believe in the Bible literally, you must not be Christian, you must be atheist. But what I want to point out, it's a fundamentally different from the atheist point of view too. Because the atheist point of view tends to suggest, and you see it in some very extreme cases in some of the people we hear speaking, the atheist point of view tends to say, well, all religion is bad and people are born essentially good. Now, if that's the case, if we are born essentially good and we're only corrupted by corrupt and bad religion, then the answer is to get rid of religion. But of course, that's not the case. We are not born good. And we must remember that. Swedenborg is not saying we are born good. He is saying that we are born into disorder, which must be, and then the order must be restored. So that's a fundamental difference from atheism. Now, anybody who looks back over the history of the last 100 years can realise that atheism got it wrong. If you look at, say, communism in Russia, and the many atrocities that were carried out in the name of atheism in order supposedly to reinstate the goodness of humanity. And it didn't work. It's not going to work. Religion actually it defines the problem and it has the answer. Atheism does not. All right, so I want to go back to the verse that I talked about. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and she ate. And I'm suggesting that it is the illusion that wisdom comes from self. On Facebook the other day, one of my friends shared this story. She was talking about a conversation she had with one of her daughters. And the mother said, "Don't argue with your sister." And the 10-year-old daughter said, "I'm not arguing." And her mother said, "Well, what are you doing then?" And she said, "I'm being right." Don't we love to have the answers? Don't we love to be right? The thing is that I've never met a person in my life who believes they're wrong. Here's a quick test for you. Pop your hand up if you've ever been wrong. Put your hand up if you've ever been wrong. Have you ever been wrong?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Put your hand up if it's possible that in the future you might also be wrong.
Oh yes, definitely.
Okay. Are you wrong now? Are you wrong now? Well, you see, there's the thing. We don't see that we are wrong in the here and now. We recognise the past, that I was wrong in the past and I changed my mind, or I found out something new and so on, which has corrected my understanding, but I'm right now. I recognise that in the future, at some point, I might make a mistake and I might be wrong, but I'm right now. I never met anyone who understood that they are wrong. We all think we're right, and everyone else is wrong if they disagree with us. But of course, someone has got to be wrong. And how do we know? Well, it's not by consulting our own intellect and our own sense of wisdom that we find that out. We need a sense of truth and reality outside of ourselves to do it. We need to look beyond ourselves. So here's what I want you to think about over the coming week. If you cannot trust your own understanding, where do you look for truth and wisdom? What are the voices? Who are the people that you listen to, and why? I'll give you an example from myself. I go looking for people who, in their discussions with me, whether they agree with me or not, can acknowledge their mistakes. I've known a number of people I've had discussions with in the past who kind of breeze over the fact that they've actually made an error. They've made a mistake. They've said something which is wrong and they've changed their mind. And I remain suspicious of those people. If they're unable to recognise their error publicly and openly to me, I think, well, hang on, they've not got a good grasp on what is true. Now, if that's the case, of course, I then need to practice that as much as I expect others to practice it. So I need to be prepared to acknowledge my own mistakes openly when that comes about. But I just want you to spend that week just reflecting on how it is, or what are the voices you listen to, and how do you determine that? Because I think it's an interesting and a useful exercise to go through. It will relate to what we talk about next week. Yes, it will. It will relate to what we talk about next week as well. So bear that in mind.